Picture a no man's land with broken windows, dark abandoned buildings, no law and order. There are carefully demarcated areas controlled by rival bands of armed militia fighting over the rubble. Nearly every night there's sniper fire. It sounds like Beirut, but in fact it's America.
The reason public housing arose in the early 1900s and later was simply to make it easier for low-income families to afford housing. Though many of these families were of African descent and previously enslaved, the black families fled the South seeking better lives and to get away from racial violence, pursue better economic opportunities, and seeking better education compared to the segregated South. Many of these main cities included Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, and St. Louis. With this large-scale migration, cities exploded in growth as more workers became available. But with more people came more crime and other problems. With growing communities of African Americans and low-income families, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Housing Act of 1937, giving $500 million in loans to projects of public housing in large cities across the country for low-income families. Many of these public housing projects were focused towards housing the growing black populations in the United States.
Chicago is considered the most gang-occupied city in the United States, with 150,000 gang-affiliated residents representing more than 100 gangs. Gang warfare and retaliation are common in Chicago and many cities like it. Gangs are responsible for 61% of homicides in Chicago in 2011 and 72% in 2017. Growing up in areas with high gang activity, exposure to violence, and a lack of safety can normalize violent behavior and increase the likelihood of gang involvement.
And how does public housing connect to gang affiliation? Gangs are more prevalent in public housing complexes because they often concentrate poverty communities in a single area, leading to limited opportunities, social disorganization, and lack of positive alternatives for young people, giving gang membership seem like a way to gain a sense of belonging and power within a disadvantaged community. This is not due to the public housing itself, but rather the social conditions associated with concentrated poverty in such areas. These gangs further grew the stereotype of poor black community living in public housing areas.
Public housing programs face several problems, including a national shortage of affordable housing, rising costs that outplace income, and the concentration of poverty in certain areas. These issues lead to overcrowded units, a lack of support services, and limited opportunities for residents. There's a significant shortage of affordable houses, with millions of homes needed to meet demand, especially for low-income families. Housing costs, including rent and property values, continue to rise, often outpacing wage growth, making it difficult for low individuals and families to afford adequate housing. To house the low-income families, public housing complexes were made in these large cities. Housing took most of a worker's money in a city. A 2 to 3 room apartment with a coal stove and a tenement could rent from $4 to $7 per month to $8 to $10 per month. It had no bath or toilet. Housing in a better neighborhood could cost $25 to $60 per month. Lodgers or miners lived in camps and had their food taken out of their wages. And compared to most black workers' salaries, they were barely able to make rent. So ideas of moving out in the future were very slim and almost impossible, which made it common for multiple generations of families to live in the same apartment.
Is institutional racism a good reason for public housing in Chattanooga and beyond to have a 70% and up minority population? This is the first question we asked Dr. Ritchie in our interview with him, and his response is as follows. Institutional racism is a very real thing in American history, but it has been so pervasive that it is actually less easy to define and quantify than a historical fact. So let's start with this. Slavery existed for hundreds of years, and slaves were not able to attain much or any wealth between 1607 and 1865. The vast majority of the descendants of slaves were not truly able to start actively pursuing wealth until roughly 150 years ago, at best, and many only since the 1960s and 70s. When some areas passed laws overhauling loan practices, most Americans accrue wealth through home ownership. So if there were whole structures such as banks, homeowners associations, lack of desegregated schools, realtors unwilling to show a family a home, and so on, then it is hard, even if you have the money, to find a home of your choice. This can be found in two great examples in American history. The first practice being redlining. For many years, banks and insurance companies rated neighborhoods as worthy or not worthy of investment. Most of the worst neighborhoods, as far as opportunity for investment, were populated by people of color. Even if someone wanted to build a new home in part of town where they were allowed to live because of segregation customs, a red area, they could not affordably get a loan or insurance to build or even fix up an older money pit home. The second example is after World War II, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, aka the GI Bill, provided loans for college and very low interest loans for housing. Millions of white Americans were able to start building wealth through this democratization of higher education. A degree equals a better job. And through buying a home, letting it gain value, then buying a better home later with their profits, many colleges and many neighborhoods excluded blacks. How are they to get the same college education and therefore higher paying jobs as whites if colleges would not allow them to enroll? How many blacks buy a new home in a neighborhood where they're excluded from a neighborhood they even had a loan?
This was the second question that we asked Dr. Ritchie during his interview. Does public housing actually help underprivileged population, or does the stereotype of having lived there hurt one's future due to stereotypes? And his answer is as follows. I think public housing does help people by giving them a roof to live under and enough stability to get a job if they are healthy and able. My guess is that a large percentage of people in public housing are over the age of 65 and in poor health. They may not physically be able to work. The whole point of public housing is to house people, obviously, in the hope that it would be able to bridge, that it would be a bridge to home ownership. If you are elderly, a spouse dies, your house burns down, and have no insurance or not enough, you have disease that makes it hard to get employed. The list goes on. Public housing may be less of a bridge than an absolute life preserver that helps you from drowning. Sometimes you can have a job and still not afford housing. Find Barbara Ehrenreich's book, Nickel and Dimed. She tried to work at a Walmart in the Keys of Florida and found that something crazy like 60 to 70% of her after-tax take-home pay went to housing. She could barely eat.
The last question we asked Dr. Ritchie in our interview was, does public housing serve as a feedback loop for the communities that happen to live there, and does it make it actually harder to escape these low-income environments and grow into a higher-paying position and job? Dr. Ritchie's response is as follows. I come back to my example of elderly people and bad health. I think the stereotype of someone living in public housing was so-called the welfare queen, who lives for free and deals drugs or is involved in a perpetual scam of taxpayer dollars by continuing to have children in order to get more handouts. That is just not true. I think most people who are young probably want out of public housing for the simple reason they want something bigger and nicer. Maybe they are embarrassed. My guess is that the vast majority of people who have a harder time going into a better place have other limiting factors. Old age, bad health, the inability to work, zero support structures in place. If the average Macaulay student 10 years from now is in a job, gets laid off, has cancer, can't work, etc., then instead of getting food stamps or public housing, they're probably simply going to call their parents and get some help. Not everyone has that luxury, and they have nowhere else to turn other than shelters, churches, and maybe a food bank. And this is what leads some populations to end up in public housing and make it very difficult for escape.
In the end, our overall consensus is that institutional racism does affect modern public housing. Black families started from behind economically and wealth-wise, so cheap housing was the easiest route for many African American families. Though again, with the jobs African Americans were given, they were not able to make enough money to grow out of the public housing areas, leading to desperate measures of gang affiliation and other sorts of crimes. Because of this, it was an easy way to stereotype poor black community, which led to more racism and segregation.